Well, good morning. My phone says it's 9:30, so I guess it's time for us to get started. I hope everyone had a happy New Year's. And as you can see, me and Michael have rotated, so we're going to be changing topics starting this morning. I believe Lee Trout's going to lead us in prayer here in just a moment. If we have any prayer requests, just looking at the bulletin, I know we need to remember Jim Dickerson and, of course, Miss Betty as well, and then Miss Gloria, who's got some further tests and biopsies coming up, and also continue to remember Justin Harper and his family and the loss of his grandmother. I believe that is pretty much what's in our announcements for now. I don't know if anyone has any that's you want us to be mindful of that we haven't gotten into the announcements yet. Bill Frone, I know some of y'all remember them. Were here with us. His brothers passed away.
My sister-in-law's service was yesterday, and my
Okay.
brother been in the hospital with the flu.
Okay, Miss Maxwell family. Your sister-in-law just had her funeral, and then yesterday, and then your brother has the flu. So yeah. That flu's going around. It's been pretty rough on some folks here recently. Right. Okay. Okay. Miss Geneva's brother-in-law passed away yesterday. Did you have something? Sherry, yes, let's continue to remember Miss Sherry Burns for sure. Okay. Remember Miss Donis having some neck issues. Anyone else? All right. Oh yeah, Justin. Let's remember Justin. He's, I guess, fixing to start chemo again. So I know that's going to be tough on him and everyone involved, I'm sure. Okay, Mr. Lee, if you don't mind, you can lead us in prayer before we begin. All right. Thank you, Mr. Lee. Luster's been passing out some blue folders for me. If you didn't get one, I think I printed enough of them, but if I didn't, and I've got a couple more up here, he's still got a few. If you raise your hand, if you didn't get one and you want one, got one up here, Luster, Miss Amy, and Susan coming in behind you. And this is nothing, it's just, I know some folks, some of you don't like taking notes, and that's fine. So you may not even want to have to keep up with one. And if you don't want one, you're not going to hurt my feelings. But I know a lot of folks like to take notes and kind of keep up with where we're going. So that's kind of what the purpose of this is. And you're kind of lucky, since I taught this last quarter, I pretty much got all of them for most of the quarter printed out. Now, I will say we missed a lot of Sundays we missed a handful of Sundays last quarter because of holidays and other things. So I'm hoping maybe we can cover a little more in here this quarter, but you never know what happens. So hopefully we can at least cover what's in the folder. And if we get toward the end and I see there's a couple other lessons that I left out last quarter, so we may add those in. And if we get the opportunity to do that, I'll bring you some copies you can stick in your folder. And as you can see, if you didn't know already, we're going to be studying Moses. When I was coming up with something to cover for these 2 quarters, he kind of came to mind. Just to me, he's one of the most intriguing characters in the Bible for several reasons. And then 2, I've never really been a part of a study where we looked at Moses specifically. Growing up, we cover a lot of the stories that Moses is involved with, as far as the Israelites and leaving Egypt and the wilderness and Pharaoh and the 10 plagues, the burning bush. It's a lot of those stories we've covered, but I've never been a part where we focus mainly on Moses and kind of what we can learn from him. Did learn last quarter. I hesitate to call it an in-depth study, because even though it's a full quarter seems like a long time, when you get to really studying Moses, and if you try to get real deep into Moses, there's so much there that we're not going to cover it all this quarter. So, but I still hope it'll be beneficial. We're still going to look at some of the stories like the burning bush and Moses' birth, but maybe from a different angle, maybe look at it with fresh eyes and talk about it from a different viewpoint as maybe we did growing up or in the past, and look at different things, and always I'm hoping have some sort of modern day application for us, and not just some of the lessons are going to start out kind of feeling like a history lesson, but trying not to make it a history lesson, make it more of a life application. And with that in mind, if you look real quick at the folder, the first couple pages there, I just put in there for you to use if you want to. That first one, I know as we talk about Moses, we're going to talk a lot about his strengths and things he was really strong at, which there's a lot of them. And then we're also probably going to talk about some of his weaknesses. So I kind of stuck that in there for you as we go along. And if you choose to study this on your own at home, just a place for you to jot down as maybe things we don't specifically talk about in here, but that come to your mind to kind of mention as his strengths and weaknesses, just so that we may come back to that later on. And then, of course, the second page there, just some lessons learned, because there's going to be some lessons learned, hopefully in each of our notes, but just kind of an overall, because, again, there's going to be some things you may think about that's not specifically pertaining to the lesson, that day, or at least my train of thought, and that's just for you to kind of jot down. And if we have time, we didn't have time last quarter, we may at different times come back to those pages and just let you kind of mention some things that you've jotted down in your own studies that might benefit the class. But to start, we're going to start on page 3 of our notes if you're a note taker, and just today is going to be a little bit just to kind of, since again we're not going to go maybe step by step or in necessary chronological order. Today I wanted to just kind of do somewhat of an overview of Moses to kind of get a baseline set before we dig a little deeper starting next week. And I will say the first looking ahead in the notes, you'll see the first few weeks we're going to spend, and it's going to take us a few weeks to get through the first few chapters of Exodus. So you may feel like we're headed into a verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter study, but after we get through those first few chapters of Exodus, then we'll start skipping around and looking at some different things. But there's so much in those first few chapters, I think you kind of got to start with those to kind of get a basis for our future studies. But just to start off kind of as a review, kind of see what you remember. Moses, his name, does anybody remember what his name actually means? Drawn out of the water. And what does that pertain to? Right. So, and we're going to look at that in a little more detail probably next week if we don't get to it today. But his meaning is drawn out of the water. And who gave him that name, the name that we know him as? Pharaoh's daughter. So something, again, interesting. Moses, this man that's leading the entire nation of Israel, his name was actually given to him by an Egyptian. And it does mean drawn out of the water because of the whole story behind his survival, I guess you'd say. And his birthplace, anybody remember where that was? It was in Egypt. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later too, of how they ended up in Egypt as God's chosen people. And more specifically, what part of Egypt was he born in? Land of Goshen. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Again, this was during the Israelite captivity. There's a couple of different opinions on the actual rough date. Most of the stuff I looked at, most folks kind of pinpointed it at around 1500 BC. If you're a numbers type person, not a crucial bit of detail, but it was somewhere around that time, 1500 BC. What about his parents? Does anybody remember what his parents' names were? Amram and Jochebed. Y'all are doing pretty good. I told the other class I started to make this out as a pop quiz and see what they could do, but decided not to do that. But y'all are doing good. So Amram and Jochebed was his mother. Exodus 2 verse 1 tells us what tribe were they from that's somewhat significant. That's right, Levi. So we know that fast forward that's going to end up being the priestly tribe. That hasn't been established yet at this time, but that is the tribe that they come from, which has some significance there. What about his spouse? What do we know about his spouse? Does anybody remember his spouse's name? That's right. There was, and that comes up a little bit. If he only had one spouse, they definitely didn't like her. There is some theory that maybe he had two spouses, and we'll look at that in just a second. But the only one that we're given a name for is Zipporah. And what do we know about her for sure? And might be some of the reason that Aaron and Miriam didn't like her. But was she an Israelite? No, she was a. Well, where do we know she was from? I think probably Ethiopia, Midian. I meant to bring, I had a map to throw up on the screen, but I didn't bring it. But if you remember, about when does Moses meet his wife? When he fled Egypt, and he fled, it tells us, to the land of Midian. So we know his wife Zipporah was from Midian. And the reference that Miss Judy was making in Numbers 12:1, when Miriam and Aaron are kind of somewhat speaking out against, or they are speaking out against Moses and his authority, they say it's because he had taken a Cushite woman. Some folks think that maybe Zipporah had died and Moses had remarried a Cushite woman, but depending on what viewpoint you have, which really is not that I guess definitely not a salvational issue, but if you, some folks believe that this may have been Zipporah they were referring to, because Midian and Cushite, Ethiopia, those are all kind of general areas and were referred to in the same kind of area at times. And one basis for that, if you want to jot it down, and I'll read it, it's a book we don't look at very much, but Habakkuk chapter 3 verse 7 is where some of that theory comes from. And this is not related to Moses, but it is talking about that area. It says, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. So in that verse there in Habakkuk, he's tying Cush and Midian together. So there's theories there that Moses only had the one wife, and it was Zipporah, and that's who Aaron and Miriam have an issue with. But all that to be said, again, we've got, and that's to me one of the intriguing things about Moses. You have Moses, who was, born in Egypt. He was an Israelite of the tribe of Levi, but who did he end up marrying? A non-Israelite. So you got this unique person that's, yet with all of that, he's still going to end up being a real significant character in the history of the nation of Israel, and really, for us as well. What about his children? And we'll talk more about that, later on too. What about his children? Anybody know who his children were? How many did he have? Exodus chapter 18:1 is one of the places. Yep, that's the ones we're mentioned. So he had two that we're aware of, and no indication that there were really any others. It says there in Exodus 18, says, Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home, along with her two sons. The name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And the name of the other, Eliezer, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So there's Gershom and Eliezer. We're told about Gershom, I believe, earlier, right after he had fled to Midian and met Zipporah, took her as his wife. We're told that he has that son, but at some point they have the second son. Another place you can see that's 1 Chronicles 23 verses 12 through 20, and there it also an interesting thing. It makes note of Moses, refers to him as the man of God, and then it's listed some of the other children as of the priestly tribe and Aaron's children, and then it lists Moses' children. Again, to me, it's an interesting thing with Zipporah and with Moses' children. That's about all we're told about his two sons. Any thoughts on that, or interesting, what does that kind of make you think about? Well, that's true. We're not given a whole lot. And kind of, the more, from just my viewpoint, in thinking about Moses and the stuff that we're going to study, is all of the good characteristics Moses had. Probably one of the, if you want to study about leadership, and this is not a leadership class, but Moses is probably one of the best examples of a leader, and then a godly leader at that, that there is. So you can't study leadership without studying Moses, and you can't really study Moses without talking a little bit about leadership. So we are going to delve off in that a little bit in some of our lessons, just because it's so strong there, the examples he sets. who's the next big leader after Moses, though? Joshua. It wasn't Gershom or Eliezer, was it? So do we always follow in our father's footsteps? Do we always learn from our father's examples? We don't. So to me, it's just an interesting thing, and a thing maybe for us as fathers to not be so hard on ourselves if our kids don't, follow in our footsteps. Sometimes our kids are stronger than us. Sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they're just not interested in that, path in life. But for whatever reason, again, going back to what Mr. Melvin said, we're not really given all those details, so we don't know why, in the verses we just read, for whatever reason, at some point, Moses sent Zipporah and the two kids back to Midian for whatever reason. We're not really told why. We're going to theorize on that a little bit in another lesson, but, why his children didn't necessarily follow in his footsteps. Not to say his children didn't end up being godly men. We really don't know. I forgot to write it down unless I'm overlooking at my notes, but there is somewhere, and I'll go back and find it and let you know later, there is a little mention of one of his grandchildren, and it's not really a good look for one of his grandchildren. Believe if my memory is right, later on when they're going in and taking the land, it ends up being Moses' grandsons or great-grandsons, ends up kind of deviating and becoming this group that kind of goes off on their own, and they take him on, kind of hire him as their priest, but he doesn't really follow all the details that God laid out. He's kind of one of those seem to be more of a political guys that kind of does whatever the people want to satisfy them, and it kind of causes some problems. I'll go back and find that. But other than that, we're really not told too much about Moses's, children. And that's somewhat a testament to the fact that Moses, in all of his works, which we'll learn, he was not about himself. He was all about God's mission and God's work. So either that distracted him or that wasn't, his focus when he wrote and told us this history. So what about just some other significant relatives of Moses? Can you think of any? Somebody's already mentioned two of them. Yep, Aaron and Miriam, his brother and sister. They come in and out of the story of Moses a lot of times.
I've often wondered why God chose Moses instead of Aaron, because Moses was not confident, and Aaron had the speech, but evidently he didn't have the heart, because
right.
led the people astray a lot of them.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on it. And that's one of the things we're going to talk a little bit more about. God sees things that we don't see. He saw something in Moses that we see play out in history, because like you said, when you get to the burning bush and Moses doesn't want to go, and God, adjusts his plan and adjust his plan. I think God already knew, because we're going to see Aaron was already on his way to see Moses when you look at that whole conversation. But God nonetheless allowed Moses to take Aaron on, but like you said, I think you see later on in the way Aaron did some things that you can say, oh, well, that's why God didn't choose Aaron, because Aaron wasn't, when it boiled down to it, wasn't as strong in character as Moses was. Now, was everything Aaron did bad? No. God still gave him what task? He was the first high priest that they had. So again, Aaron, and we're talking about humans here. When we're studying, I think sometimes when we study the Bible, we make the mistake of looking at it like a movie or a mythical book that we're reading and think of these as superhuman people. But we're going to see Moses was human like we are. He made mistakes. Aaron was human, and sometimes we want to look at Moses as a one-dimensional personality, but I think we'll see, he was human. He had different, not different personalities, but his personality wasn't one-dimensional. He had strengths and he had weaknesses. Sometimes his weaknesses got stronger, and sometimes those weaknesses came back to haunt him. And, just like we as humans have our good days and our bad days, our ups and downs, I think you have the same thing with Aaron. He, had his weaknesses that got the better of him at times. But again, that's an interesting thought, and again, one of the reasons Moses to me is so interesting to study.
God knows the heart.
Right.
Just like when he chose David as king, he knew his heart. Others were to be what he wanted.
Right.
But God knows his heart. That's what he chose.
Yep. I think you're right. And one of the things we're going to look at is a lot of times we don't understand why God may be pushing us in a direction to serve him in a certain way because we feel like, well, we're not capable of that. Well, God knows better than we do what we're capable of. And sometimes there's a reason why he's, pushing us in those directions. And again, we're kind of just hitting the high points today, but we're going to come back and look at some of these more in depth. So I just kind of want to get your thoughts flowing today, and then we'll dig a little deeper and start next week. But occupations, when you think about Moses and his occupation, what would you label some of his occupations? Yeah, there's theories there, good and pretty strong theories that he was next in line to be a pharaoh because of who his, there's different theories depending on that date of when he was born, who his mother was, and if you go back and read, and I did a good bit of reading, but not even enough reading. There's so much there on, because Egypt, in the nation and the type nation they were, they documented a lot of their history with their rulers. So there is a lot of information given on those pharaohs, and you'll see there was a lot of women who weren't necessarily pharaohs, but they were considered queens, and because of the weakness of character of the pharaohs at that time, sometimes the queens actually called the shots more so than the actual pharaohs. So, and there's some theories in there that one of these queens could have been Moses' mother, which would have put Moses up there, in the mix of being possibly a ruler, which again tells you a whole lot about Moses as a person and a character, because we'll see Moses himself chose to walk away from that. So that he's like those type people that you hear about, the NFL football stars that walk away from millions of dollars to join the military and serve their country, and other people like that. And that's kind of somewhat the situation Moses was in. And again, we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. So that was one. He was definitely part of the royal family, and some folks think possibly he was, and how long did he do that, or was in that 40 years? So, I mean, a lot of by 40 years old, for us, we're pretty much set the path of our career. We don't, a lot of times, don't go from being very few folks at 40 years old stop being a doctor and go, be a lawyer, or, you don't completely change directions. You might change from one company to another, and, but you stay, if you decide you're going to be an engineer, you stick in that career field for the most part. But Moses had done this till he was 40 years old, so a lot of experience, a lot of time spent there. Some people, scholars even theorize that he was a leader of a part of Pharaoh's army, so he had experience with battles and leading people, even before he, fled Egypt, which again goes back to, God and his providence. And Moses didn't realize he was being trained for what he was being trained for at that time, but he was being trained for something, I think, that he didn't really understand. Any other occupations? Yep, he was a shepherd. How long was he a shepherd? 40 years. So he went from being a, royalty, living in a palace, probably being able to tell somebody to go do something, and then they just went and did it because they knew not to question to Moses, to being a shepherd, big career change. And whose sheep were they? Jethro's, his father-in-law. So it wasn't even his sheep. He was a hired hand, basically. And there's a lot we can learn from Moses when we talk about that career change, and we'll talk about that some more. So you got two pretty different, contrasting career paths there that he does, each one for roughly 40 years. So what about some others? He was a godly leader, and basically his life can be broken up into basically 40-year sections. 40 years in Egypt. It's real easy to remember. 40 years in Egypt, 40 years as a shepherd, and then he's going to be 40 years as a leader of God's people. So if you break that down into details, talking about leader of God's people, what all did he do as part of that? That were basically different tasks, responsibilities he had that for some of us are careers in and of themselves. He settled disputes, so basically he was a judge. For a big part of what he did was mediating between the people when they had arguments amongst themselves. So yes, he served as a judge. Mm-hmm. Right, and we're going to spend probably a whole Sunday talking about that, because that's one of those I was referring to when Jethro gives him that advice, that there's a whole lot of stuff in that whole story that you can learn as far as being a leader, not just in church, but even you can apply that to if you're a leader in where you work or running your own business. There's some things there about delegation, division of responsibility, burnout, taking on too much, not trusting the people that work for you. I mean, it's a whole lot of stuff. So that is going to be one of our whole lessons there. But yes, he was a judge. What about some other responsibilities he had? Right, he was. He was God's messenger. He was a prophet. And again, one of the very unique things about Moses, he's one of the few, if not only, that is referred to knew the Lord face to face. If you go to Deuteronomy 34:10, where it talks about that, that's a whole interesting topic in and of itself, because we know we're told no one can see God's face and live. So if you look at that, it's more of a figurative thing. He didn't actually see God's quote face, but he did come in the presence of God, and that's where we get one of the songs of the cleft of the rock or whatever. He goes up on the mountain, God's presence passes by, and Moses is able to see the Lord's backside. Interesting, Moses never told us what that was like. We probably wouldn't have comprehended it anyway, but yes, Moses had a very close relationship with God for sure, and was the in-between and deliverer, and a lot of that was somewhat at the people's request. They feared God so much because of what little bit they saw with God up on the mountain that they didn't want to go anywhere close, which again tells you something about Moses' character, that he was. A lot of times we look at the story of the burning bush and think Moses was a wimp. He was a coward. He was scared to go see Pharaoh. He didn't want to be, but you see stuff like that, and he was willing to go up in the mountain with thunder and lightning, and whatever that looked like, it was impressive enough that the people, didn't want to be anywhere close to that mountain. But Moses went right on up. So it tells you a lot about his character. Any other occupations you can kind of think about? That's a big one. How many books did he write of the Scripture? Yeah, it's most likely 5, possibly 6. There's some theory that he actually was we don't know who wrote Job, the book of Job, because it's such an oddball book. It doesn't really fit in a lot of places. There's some people, I don't know what they base it off of, but there's some theories that he wrote the book of Job while he was in Midian. I don't know how strong of a case there is for that, but he did write what we refer to as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. There's pretty strong evidence for that. We know he wrote the law, the 10 Commandments, and that's a whole story in of itself. He was there present, and how many times was the 10 Commandments carved in stone? Twice, and it's pretty good argument that the second time, because of Moses' actions after the first time, Moses was the one that actually had to carve it in. But there's several places. Exodus, we'll look at a couple. Exodus chapter 17, verse 14. There it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in the book and recite in the ears of Joshua." So there's some stuff there. There's several places God actually is telling Moses, write this down. Chapter 24 of Exodus, verses 4 and I believe 7. Verse 4 says, "And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes." And one that's there's several more. Exodus 34:27, if you're taking notes. Numbers 33, verses 1 and 2. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 9. Joshua 8:32. Then one in the New Testament, if you look at John chapter 5, verses 46 and 47. Numbers 33, verses 1 and 2. And John chapter 5, verses 46 through 47. "For if you believed," and this is Jesus himself talking here, which is why I wanted to go to this one. "For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" So whether he wrote all the books we're talking about, we know he wrote some stuff because Jesus himself's referring to the writings of Moses. So that's a pretty strong case there. Another interesting one, and then there's Deuteronomy 31, verse 24. And then the last one I wanted to look at, which is to me was an interesting one, is Genesis chapter 13, verse 10. And this is talking about Lot. So when did, in the history of time, when did Lot fall in relation to Moses? Way before. So, which would be before what? Israel was in Egypt, right? In captivity. So, verse 10, "And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zor." So what does that have to do with Moses writing the book of Genesis? Yeah, and if he's this author, whoever wrote Genesis is comparing, he's writing to his audience, trying to describe to them what this land that Lot was looking at looked like, and he compared it to the land of Egypt. So that's some, I guess, a piece of evidence there that Moses was writing this to the people of Israel, and they had been in Egypt, so they would have had a picture in their mind of what this looked like. I just thought that one was kind of interesting. So yes, in Moses being an author, what does that make you, I guess, think about? Right. And we'll look at that next week. I'm part of God's providence and the way he lays things out. Moses was a well-educated person. We'll look at some verses that tell us that. So he definitely had the capability of doing that. How much, has anybody ever tried to sit down? I mean, I know we all had to write stuff in school, but has anyone ever sit down and tried to write a book before? How much time does that take and energy? It takes a lot, and we know at least some of what Moses was doing was he was chiseling it in stone. So that, I don't know if that was their only means of writing at that point, but if that's the case, then yeah. So probably papyrus and such. But even then, they didn't have a computer with spell check and backspace, and they didn't even have the. I know when I took typing in high school, you had to use a little whiteout stuff if you weren't very good at typing. But you know, he didn't have all that. Right, didn't even have a ballpoint pen. So it's just thinking about Moses, and this is where a lot of times you know, when you look at the whole picture, if you compare Moses' life to our life and all the things he did, you know, it kind of steps on your toes a lot if you really think about all the stuff he did. I doubt, I mean, we just talked about the big sections of his life. What did Moses do when he retired? Right, he never retired. And that's not to say retirement's bad. I mean, I look forward to it every day. But when you talk about what we're talking about, service of God, Moses never retired physically, because he's kind of like preachers. His spiritual service and his physical occupation blended together and were the same thing. So he never retired from either. But you know, I think sometimes we as Christians think, well, once I hit a certain age, and I know age and health, and Moses is a little different, because we'll look at that. God was with Moses for sure. So his physical, I'm saying he was in better shape than when he died than I was when I was 18, 19 years old. So that comes into play, I know, with us as humans, and in today's time, that as we age, things that we can do physically change. But as far as us retiring from God's service, we may not have the energy to go teach 2-year-olds like we used to, but there's still things that we can do to serve God at any age. And that's kind of one of the big lessons we can learn from Moses, is there is no retirement age from serving God. And then too, just, the thought of all the things Moses did, I don't really see anywhere in studying. I know we go back to God doesn't tell us everything. Surely Moses had some downtime where he just chilled and relaxed, but I don't see it anywhere. I don't see him taking vacations to the beach. And again, not that there's not good things and that we shouldn't. I mean, I take plenty of vacations myself, but just Moses as a extreme example. He spent a lot of time, and no way he could have done all this stuff and quote punched out and checked out very often. I think the closest thing we see is when Jethro comes to visit him. Moses takes at least maybe a day off to go visit with Jethro. But then there's some lessons learned on that too. Back to what we'll look at, and what Mr. Melvin mentioned, is that Moses to some degree was taking on too much. So there is needed time for rest and recharging and re-energizing. But I think sometimes we take that to an extreme, and sometimes we use excuses that we don't have time to do good things that we know we ought to do because we've got this time set aside for our personal hobbies and such. As so again, there's some toe stepping that Moses is going to do to us, I think, as we study throughout this. We're getting close to time, so those are, I think y'all mentioned most, just some of the things I had. Leader, of course, lawgiver. We mentioned he was a writer, a prophet, and a judge, kind of a liaison between the people and God. The one we kind of talked around and didn't mention, but he was also a teacher. He spent a lot of time because he was a liaison and God was talking directly to him, he spent a lot of time going and teaching the people. One of the last things he did was this long speech to the people of, all right, my time has come. I'm about to hand this off, and reminded them, remember what you did back here. Remember what God did to you, encouraging them to follow God and stay with God. So he did a lot of teaching as well.
When I was in Jordan, I did a lot of thinking about Moses. I actually saw the desert.
Yeah.
I saw Mount Nebo where he was over.
Yeah.
And if you've ever seen what it's like there, can't imagine. He was, I guess, a Bedouin because for 40 years
Yeah.
he traveled in the desert.
Yeah. It was significant enough that it came into play when he named his second, or one of his sons.
Dedicated was to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I would go every day looking at ruins and stuff, and my knee finally just totally went out.
Right.
Climbing and doing
Yeah.
all. And it's all rock. It's not
Yeah.
fertile land. It's just nothing.
Right.
It's hot.
Yeah.
And I just can't imagine.
He definitely gave up a life of luxury to go do this, even though he was at times a little resistant to it. But he, and that's another thing we'll learn about him. We focus a lot on the burning bush, but then we forget to look at what he actually did after that. To me, once he decided to do it, and again, another lesson for us, he was all in and all 100% effort, and there were times where God gave him an out. God said, step away. I'm fed up with these people. I'm going to destroy them, and I'll just start over with you. Again, that Moses could have been the rebirth of the nation or whatever, and God is perfect, does no wrong, so God would have been completely justified in doing that. Yet Moses was fully committed to the task at hand, that he actually spoke up and put himself at a disadvantage and took on more hardship on himself.
All the people, all the Israelites kept wanting to turn away and worship idols and all this.
Yeah.
He had to fight all that.
Yeah.
And go through all the hardships they were
Yeah.
and lead them.
Yeah. Again, you can't help but talk about leadership when you talk about Moses, but the patience he had with the people he was leading was probably better than maybe anybody else ever.
Well, I was just thinking about his physical stamina, because God did take care of him during that.
He did.
Blessed his eyes, like different things like that, because he was serving. So he was, and I don't mean to take away from Moses, but God did bless him.
Right. That's true. Yeah, there was a lot, because of the task he had. It's obviously God was involved and helped out with that. Any other thoughts? We got like 2 minutes, so I'll go ahead and let you go early. A couple of if you're taking notes, and these will probably come up a little more. We already talked about one. Exodus chapter 33, verses 11 and 12. These are just some interesting things that's unique about Moses, that's intriguing to think about, where it talks there that, again, tells you a lot about Moses, that God spoke to Moses as one speaks to a friend, which that in itself tells you a whole lot, and we'll talk about that a little more. And that's the same place where you get kind of where Moses actually sees God. And then Exodus 34:29 is the story where Moses spends so much time in the presence of God. We don't really know what that was like, but we know it affected Moses to the extent that his face was so bright that when he came down from the mountain, it scared the people to where they run away from him, and he had to wear a veil. We don't really know how long. Some folks say maybe he wore a veil the rest of his life, but I don't know that was the case. But it obviously affected him. Being in the presence of God affected him physically to the point where it changed his appearance to where it was frightening for the people. So that just, again, Moses was a very unique person, unlike anyone else. So it's interesting to think about some of those things. So next week, if you want to go ahead and read, start reading the first few chapters of Exodus, because we're going to kind of slow down a little bit and dig into those chapters almost a verse by verse, just to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to talk about later. But and it's a lot we can learn about life just from studying, Moses's early years. But I do thank you for your comments. And if you didn't get a folder, I don't know if Lester's got any. He's giving out. I've got a couple more up here. But if you want one and didn't get one, just be sure to let me know, and I'll print some more before next week if you do want those. Again, thank y'all for your comments, and I look forward to studying this a little deeper with you